with her project. So Sarah Harvey is based at Inform at King's College London, and she's going to talk about natural, here with some scare quotes or quote marks. I don't need to don't need to be scary. Natural birth practices as sources of meaning. Thanks, Sarah. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Lois. I'm just gonna try and share my screen, which has not always been going well for me lately, so I hope
it's going well
to work. Yeah, now I just need to do the slideshow, don't I?
Yeah.
Just to say while I'm getting this up that I put the scare quotes on because there's so many different contested meanings of the natural in childbirth, and also I don't think it's as organized a movement as it perhaps is in the States. The way in which Taylor was describing just now, so that's why the scare quotes are there, but it's not really scary, obviously. So just to say a little bit about me, my day job is I work for a charity that provides information on new and minority religions. So I write a lot about religious movements, about gender, health, and issues of abuse within them. I haven't published anything on natural childbirth. This is from my doctoral dissertation, which seems to be a bit of a theme of the event. I completed my PhD in 2018, so it's quite old information now. It was quite nice to go back and look at it for this conference that we're at today. So I'd just like to start with this quote. I won't read it out because you can read it yourselves. This was just before I started my PhD fieldwork. I did my fieldwork over 2012, 2013, so this was coming up to the end of 2011. And it was a piece on BBC Breakfast News here in the UK, where they were discussing elective caesarean, and Virginia was an independent midwife giving her perspective, and Pauline was the elective caesarean advocate giving her opinion. And I was just really struck by Virginia's quote at the end there, that birth is ideological, and the themes that she brought up in this interview really kind of encapsulated the things that I wanted to investigate in my research. So I was really interested in women who self-identified as interested in natural birth, who took this ideological approach to birth. And influenced by my background in religious studies, I really wanted to know why some women took this approach to birth, what they meant by the term natural, and then perhaps most importantly, how they worked to achieve this. So my questions were around, why do some women become involved in natural birth groups, and what does the natural mean in this context? And then what do they do during their pregnancies to prepare for a natural birth? And why do they say that they need to learn and practice natural birth? And the questions driving this fieldwork really came out of what I saw as a lack in some of the sociology of childbirth literature, which seemed to either focus on structural factors over agency and lived experience, or perhaps dismissed natural birth as something unattainable and as setting women up for failure. So I think there are a number of areas in which religious studies literature can add to this debate around natural childbirth. Firstly, I looked at the development of natural birth in conjunction with what's been termed the wider holistic milieu, in the olden days was perhaps called the New Age, and shared ideas of the self, the body, and people's place in the world, such as ideas around natural birth as part of a move towards living lightly on the earth, and connected to this, claims of sacred earth, sacred birth. I also focused on participation in natural birth groups as a search for meaning making beyond the religious secular divide, in a specific embodied situation in which existing boundaries and categories of the self, the body, and expectations of pain, amongst other things, are challenged. And an interest that I had in lived religion and ritual theory led me to focus on practices as constitutive of meaning and not simply reflecting ideas. So I considered the practices taught in private antenatal courses and the practice of these at home as ritualizations, that is, as acts with special significance, which comment on the world as it ought to be rather than as it is, and which enact an opposition to another, so thus also making them about identity formation. These are some of the books that I was looking at and which my research participants were also recommending to me. For my fieldwork, I did participant observation and narrative interviews with a focus on practices. The observation was of 4 different antenatal courses: hypnobirthing, NCT, active birth, and antenatal yoga, as well as various social events. And I also conducted interviews with 43 women, either pregnant women, women who had given birth in the last 2 years, or midwives and antenatal teachers. And of course, there was interaction and blurred categories between these groups as well. So the women I interviewed had invested time, money, emotions, and more in achieving a particular type of birth, one which was outside of the mainstream medical context. They were all preparing for an ideal birth which had common elements, although they might be stressed to different extents. This included a birth that was as pain relief free as possible, not induced, and in a calm and relaxed birthing environment, amongst other things. In much of the public discourse around birth, a dichotomy is portrayed between a medical model of birth on the one hand and what is variously termed a midwifery, a holistic, a natural, or a normal model of birth on the other. And the history of the natural model is portrayed as a story of increasing medicalization, a story of the exclusion of midwives and control of birthing women by the male medical profession, as we've heard in some of the other talks today. One of the key figures in the development of natural birth was a male doctor, however. In 1933, Grantley Dick Reed first published his book, Natural Childbirth, in which he outlined what he called the fear, tension, pain syndrome. He argued that the only reason there was pain in childbirth was because civilized women were conditioned to fear birth, which caused tension in their bodies and hence a real experience of pain. He also had a religious argument to this, but I won't go into that here. His book was republished in the 1940s as Childbirth Without Fear, and in 1956, the National Childbirth Trust was founded based on his teachings. And this is now the UK's largest parenting charity and is a significant consumer group being consulted by government and healthcare professionals in policy making. But it's seen as, by some, such as those involved in hypnobirthing, as moving away from Dick Reed's original teachings and as focusing only on information provision. Hypnobirthing, on the other hand, was developed by Marie Mongan in America in the 1980s and is portrayed as a recapturing of the ideas of Grantley Dick Reed. It seeks to eradicate fear of birth through a positive birthing philosophy and through a set of skills which claim to reduce pain through helping the woman stay calm and focused and allowing natural birthing instincts to take over. As well as teaching self-hypnosis for relaxation, visualization, and massage, it advocates changing the medical language of birth and refusing to listen to the negative birth stories of friends or in the media. Hypnobirthing and other natural birth groups also draw on radical feminism and the women's health movement of the 1970s, which claimed that the medical profession was part of the patriarchal system, which sought to control and oppress women by regulating their bodies and by reconstructing natural processes as health problems which needed surveillance and treatment. So these kind of movements focus on reclaiming the birth experience for women, often from the medical profession. And they're based on assumptions around birth has the potential to be empowering and the female body has the natural ability to give birth. And these kind of ideas really resonated in some of my interviews. And you can see a couple of quotes there that really encapsulate those kind of ideas. So in the examples above, I considered the natural as a sacred form, as a normative and a non-negotiable reality which confers authority and legitimates practices. In these kind of ideas, connections are made between the natural, healthy, tradition, and moral evaluation of good, including such ideas as being in tune with and trusting the body, following instinct, and connecting with other women across time and space. But what I also found was that motivating factors and lived experience are always more complex than being driven by these simple moral dichotomies, such as a distinction between the natural and the medical. Women participated in natural birth groups because of a combination of ideological, practical, social, and almost accidental factors, such as coming across a book or a class by accident and then becoming progressively socialized into that natural birth milieu. Even decisions around home birthing, which is a representation of the ideal, were governed by practical factors as much as ideological, such as one woman who wanted to avoid a long trip to hospital in the snow. So I came to describe the ideal birth as one with particular qualities associated with the natural, but also the perception that these qualities have been chosen, both in the run-up to birth and during the event. And it is the fact that they are chosen that makes the qualities a moral force. So whilst the ideal birth has the potential for failure built in and is not necessarily prescriptive around the natural, it does create a moral framework in which certain practices make sense and create meaning. The ideal exists as a goal to be worked towards, and attempt to attain it constitutes what I termed the work of birth, although I'm not claiming that I coined that term. Obviously, it's been used a lot, but I used it particularly in my thesis to consider ideas around planning, preparation, and practice for birth. And the work of birth is a working on the self, which encompasses at least 3 interconnected areas. This is physical work, such as various forms of exercise, diet, and learning breathing techniques and upright positions for labour. Participation in an antenatal exercise class is not simply about getting fit, but is about embodying natural birth through training the body in a certain way. So it's the exercises and diet of pregnancy and the positions and alternative pain techniques used in labour which actualise the ideal natural birth. And one of the key symbols of this is being active in labour and taking upright positions for birth, which is seen as both natural and traditional, in the sense that this is what women have done throughout the ages. And there's a quote there from Janet Velasquez, who was the founder of the active birth method, who writes that we can regain a link with our primitive female heritage by re-educating our bodies in the habits, movements, and postures which are instinctive to the childbearing women. I also considered emotional work in this, such as through fear release and relaxation exercises and repeating positive affirmations, all of which are central to hypnobirthing. And some women also spoke of attending counselling sessions in order to deal with problematic issues in their first births or in their antenatal history, such as miscarriage, whilst others spoke of having to resolve issues with other members of their families. And a few spoke of more religious or spiritual practices to deal with these issues, such as shamanic journeying, again making parallels with the holistic milieu. And then third, there is the area of mental or cognitive work, which includes reading, participating in discussion groups online, writing a birth plan, and above all through research, which is emphasised time and time again in the women's narratives. And many of the women, and this is in line with intensive parenting more generally, approach the pregnancy and birth as something of a research project. They take upon themselves the responsibility to analyse the latest scientific evidence of a particular vein, such as neuroscience theories which support attachment parenting practices in order to make their decisions and arguments. And the research project, including the birth plan, can be seen as a means of trying to retain control. And there's some interesting things going on here with regard to positive and negative evaluations of control, with control over the birth environment being the goal, combined with relinquishing control to the body and its processes. But obviously I don't have time to go into that very much here. So whilst I've broken the practices down into components for analysis, the women themselves often spoke of the importance of practice in general, and I think they mean 2 things by this. One, that the practices must be regularly engaged with. Repetition is important in preparing body and mind through inscribing the ideal birth on the body. And 2, that practice provides meaning as a concept in and of itself. That is, whatever the chosen practice is, the importance lies in that the woman has spent time selecting her practices and that she is actively working to prepare herself for birth. And this is kind of emphasised in Kim's statement here, where she says you work hard and you prepare in your pregnancy physically and mentally to have the birth that you want. So, sorry, I've skipped ahead. Okay. So I use ritualization theory to think about these practices. Ritualization is about the subjunctive mode, the world of oughts, assertions of difference, and strategic ways of acting that give the act a special or privileged status that communicates the message, this has extra significance. And the practices of natural birth are a working out and a working towards the ideal birth as a statement of difference towards the mainstream medical model. So the women who practice, who I spoke with, are investing more in their births than the imagined constructed other who does nothing to prepare. And it is practice that sets them apart as different. So I think that through performing their practices, including talking about them with friends online or to me as the interviewer, the women were doing two different but related things. First, the concept of practice protects the ideal birth. If the woman feels that she has put in enough work encompassing all three areas described and that her work has been respected by others, such as recognition paid to her birth plan, she is more likely to interpret her birth experience positively, regardless of whether all the elements of the ideal birth were achieved. And there's a quote from Stephanie there, which really emphasizes that towards the second half of the quote there. She says, if I go into birth thinking I sort of half-heartedly did it, it will be my own fault. Whereas I thought, if I give it everything I've got, then c'est la vie. However it happens, it's supposed to happen, and I can't then berate myself afterwards for not putting in enough effort. So the work of birth seems to protect both the ideal and the women from feelings of failure. They've done everything they can to have their nicer birth, and they have demonstrated this through their work and practice. For many of the women I interviewed who had more than one child, this protection meant that failure to have a natural birth did not entail failure of the ideal. It was also worked towards in subsequent births. And none of the women I interviewed rejected the natural model as the ideal, although the nature of the self-selecting sample must be kept in mind here. So the work of birth, the repeated practices, provided meaning to the women in their pregnancies and births. Secondly, practice contributes to their construction as responsible mothers, and that is in scare quotes. The performance of the practices is about the performance of a particular subjectivity, that of the good and responsible mother. Through their performance, the women are making a moral statement, a different kind of moral argument here, not about how to birth exactly, but about taking responsibility for the birth. So in the negotiation of the ideal and the practical, which was the focus of my research, there is more going on than just planning for a birth. The negotiation is part of a quest for meaning making and a moral project of the self, as well as the commentary on the need to take responsibility of both their bodies and their health in general, and for actively contributing to the best possible birth outcome and the baby's best start in life. The planning and practice which goes into the work of birth is about trying to balance public moral meanings with one's own individual experience and situation. And there's also importance in the construction and telling of the birth story. The ethical reflections this entails are going on all the time in the positive birth groups and hypnobirthing coffee mornings that some of the women attended, as well as the comments that the women make on social media pages. And a sense of community and of sharing knowledge about the birth is important to many of the women, not only for the practical support network, but because it demonstrates to others a particular form of birth and hence a particular form of mother. The work of birth is the beginning of the woman's identity as a mother, and it can set the course for parenting practice. Many of the women I interviewed, for instance, had gone on to practice different elements of attachment parenting. And there's a quote there from Vicky, which kind of really summarizes what was implicit in many of my interviews, that they want to go down that different route. So just some conclusions here. By analysing the women's practices and the narration of them through a religious studies lens, which is sensitive to meaning making, I hope to shed light or to show why some women want a natural birth, why they invest resources in specific forms of antenatal education, and why they think it necessary to plan and practice for a natural birth, even if they know this is not always going to be achieved. I think that the women should not be considered as engaged in an individualist pursuit of the birth I want, or of making moral statements about their superiority for embodying the responsibility of birth. Or rather, they are doing this, but this is only part of the picture. In making a balance between the public moralized and generalized discourse and their own individual and practical situations, They can also be considered as in a pursuit of meaning and making ethical decisions through relationships in the moment of pregnancy and birth. And this balance is made through planning and practice, and it is this itself and the interpretation of this in relation to the specific form which birth takes in the end, whether they have felt in control and that their planning and practice has not been wasted, which provides meaning. Hence, they seek to share or perform these practices with others, not simply to be moralizing, but because they provide them with significant meaning, not only in the embodied event of pregnancy and birth, but also beyond this. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.